Welcome to season 2 of the Jeremy Mullins podcast, where we take a deep dive into different educational topics to help you optimize your life. I am Jeremy, your host, a strength and conditioning coach and dietitian. And today I am flying solo, finishing up our nutrition chapter here in the FM-22. I hope you guys have enjoyed a little bit of a change up as it could be a little bit dry as I'm reading it to. It's almost like a book on tape, but then giving, my experience and my opinion with some of the topics. Okay. And I think it's a great resource for soldiers and for leaders within the Army. But I think we must understand that it's not necessarily set in stone, some of the recommendations. It will be a lot of times trial and error in making adjustments, making changes inside of nutrition plans. So today we're going to have event fueling and post exercise and things to take into consideration when it comes to therapeutic nutrition plans inside of individuals. Okay. As I've always said, remember, there's not a one size fits all nutrition plan. Okay. Some people are going to like to eat 3 times a day. Some people are going to be able to like to eat 7 times a day, right? Each person is different. What we have to do is continue to play a little bit with trial and error to see what works best for you as an individual. And for some people, this might be, different, say, for example, in your 20s versus your 40s. Okay. So what you do in your 20s nutritionally might not be what you do in your 40s. Okay. This could be secondary to aging, but it could also be secondary to what are your goals in these stages. Okay. As always, I would be highly welcome and, thankful that you do recommend the podcast to someone else. My goal is to grow the amount of people that I can educate in this platform. We're putting a lot of resources into it, putting a lot of effort into it. And it's always nice to see it growing. And I'll be more than happy to email us, Jeremy at jeremymullinspodcast at gmail.com, any topics that you guys want me to cover or any books for that matter. If this series has been good, we could always take maybe some nutritional books, do some reading on it or do some takeaways and kind of talk about it. I think that's important too, from the aspect inside of the overall educational platform. Okay. So without further ado, let's get started with section 829, event fueling and post-event recovery. Soldiers consider some factors when choosing pre-event, during, and post-event fueling, recovery, nutritional strategies. Although not all inclusive, these factors include the following: usual macronutrient intake, such as carbohydrate, proteins, and fats. And I think this is important based on what I like to talk about. I think that we have a baseline nutrition. You should have a baseline nutrition plan, that protein and calories is the main aspect that we look at. But as you get further along in your journey, you might have a certain amount of carbs and fats that you also take into play. And then we fuel additional for our training. This works really well when people are in a caloric deficit. So we have a set number of macros that we're hitting on a day-to-day basis. And then if we're fueling over what would be baseline exercise, running for 2 hours, for example, then we want to fuel extra. Okay. And this is a great way to only achieve our goal of fat loss, but also work on the performance goal simultaneously. Time lapse between macronutrient intake and start of physical activity, duration of the intensity of the physical activity, environmental conditions, individual gut intolerance. Most people who fail endurance events, it's secondary to gut issues, not because they weren't physically fit enough to finish said endurance event. Personal taste and preference, duration of fueling, body composition goals, impact performance. Energy and caloric needs increase with increases in exercise frequency, intensity, and time and type. And I think this is just a good way to point out, remember, that is the things that go into what we change inside of exercise programs. Frequency, how often are we training? Intensity, how hard are we training? Time, how long do we train? And the type would be, are we resistance training? Are we doing cardio? Are we doing a combination of both? Soldiers should adjust based on the type of exercise completed. The 4 variables, often referred to as the FITT principle. Energy needs will fluctuate as changes in frequency, intensity, time, and type occur. Therefore, soldiers should consult with a registered dietitian, aka me, to determine the energy need on how to adjust the alterations, physical activities, physical demands of duty, or both. And that's what we'll get into today is some generic recommendations. Okay, how much fuel for the activity that we're doing do we add on to our baseline nutrition? Okay. Right now, I know a lot of you listeners out there that I'm working with, you're on your fat loss journey, but we're also got this half Ironman we're training for, or this marathon we're training for, and therefore we're providing fuel, okay, in that training, right, for those training scenarios. Nutrient timing. Nutrient timing involves proper fueling strategies before, during, and after physical training sessions and all other strenuous activities. If done correctly, soldiers' strategies can help to prevent energy deficits, aid in adequate recovery, and then the soldiers consume nutrients. It's just as important what nutrients they consume. When soldiers consume nutrients, it's just as important what nutrients they consume. Each and every body functions differently in response to fueling for training. What works for one person may not work for another. So it's recommended that each soldier practice nutrient timing while training. Dietitians do not recommend applying recommendations right before the ACFT event. Okay, so that's just saying like, hey, don't try something new the day of your event. Okay, we want to trial and error inside of training so that when we go implement it inside of our race or on, if particular here, talking about soldiers, the day of our ACFT. Okay, and as a rule of thumb, we talk about carbohydrate being the primary fuel source for higher intensity activity. Okay. So remember, fat is your primary fuel source for lower intensity activity. I would like to see your carbohydrate in and around your training. Okay. Especially if you're in a reduced caloric diet. So when you're a reduced caloric diet, making sure that you're putting your carbs in and around training is going to help with your performance inside of that training. Okay. This is specifically like not only physically, but mentally. Okay. Because when you start running low on muscle glycogen or running low on blood glucose levels, and when I say low on blood glucose levels, I'm not talking about super low, just talking about a little bit low, then that's going to take away from our attentiveness when it comes to that particular activity. Like mentally, you're going to get tired. So as a rule of thumb, put carbs in and around your activity, right? So if you're eating, 300 grams of carbs per day, we might want to put 200 of those like in and around training. So in our pre-meals and our post-meals would be a good idea. And that's just a rule of thumb. Okay. So don't be like, oh, it's 2/3. That's what Jeremy said. Generic recommendations. Before exercise, before strenuous activities, consuming carbohydrate-rich foods and fluids in the 2 to 4 hours before exercise helps to restore liver glycogen, increase muscle glycogen stores, and prevent hunger. So kind of going what into data will show us that we have low muscle glycogen, low liver glycogen, that we can fatigue not only from a physical standpoint, but also a mental standpoint inside of training. Soldiers who lose appetite or feel nauseated shortly before their training or ACFT should allow 3 to 4 hours before a meal and performance. So general rule of thumb, there's not a set time that you want to eat before training or event. Try to consume easier to digest foods closer it is to your training event. So for example, applesauce would be something you want to have closer to the event versus an apple, maybe you have further away. Okay, so there's not a set stone of when you should eat. It's just, as a general rule of thumb, easier to digest foods the closer it is to training session or to event. Eating before gastric distress occurs allows the athlete to get the calories needed and can prevent vomiting related to nervousness. So people are going to get nervous inside of activities. I always say this is the reason a lot of people have, quote, race gut on the day of your event. Same guideline applies to soldiers who get diarrhea shortly before training activity. Anxiety increases gastric contractions and moves food through the gastrointestinal tract. There we go. Having trouble reading today. Eating can stimulate the bowels even more, so dietitians recommend eating well ahead of the physical event. So this is you want to plan it ahead, play with it, see what works best for you. Research suggests pre-exercise meal contain 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. Consume 1 to 4 grams or 1 to 4 hours prior to exercise provides enough performance. Here are going to be some examples. Okay, an hour or less, you could do fresh fruit, and I would encourage fresh fruit that you actually peel off the outside, because remember, if you think about eating an apple, the outside of an apple, that's going to be fiber. It's going to take longer to digest. So we're looking at things here more like your watermelon, your peaches, oranges, stuff like that. Or like I mentioned, applesauce would be something that you could do in that aspect. You could also do a carbohydrate drink here, so just a carbohydrate like a Gatorade, Powerade, that type of traditional drinks. You could do in this situation an hour or before. You could do like the energy packets. You could do goos. Goos is just a type of energy packet. You could do honey, maple syrup. All these would be simple carbohydrates that you could do an hour or less before training to get that carbohydrate, get that fuel source in there. 2 to 3 hours before an event, this is where you could look at things more like your breads, your bagels, English muffins, oatmeal, yogurt, cream cheeses, that type of stuff with a small amount of butter, syrup. I would say still 2 to 3 hours out, you could do a little bit of protein with those carbohydrate sources, because 2 or 3 hours, you don't want to do a large meal, but you would still want to have a protein source there to kind of help stabilize the blood glucose levels and slow the digestion down a little bit. And then 3 to 4 hours before your event, you could probably eat normal, as long as you're not overeating in that sense. During exercise, consuming carbohydrate during exercise lasting greater than 60 minutes can delay the onset of fatigue and improve endurance capacity by maintaining blood glucose levels. This is not only mentally, but also physically. Mentioned that a couple of times, okay? Physically, yes, you go low on fuel, it's going to have a decreased performance, but also low on glucose or carbohydrate can affect mental performance big time in endurance events. So it's recommended that, anything that lasts 60 minutes or longer, that we do consume carbohydrate and fuel during that event. Endurance here, they got at 30 to 60 grams of carbs an hour, anything up to like a 2.5 hour event, and then anything over 2.5 hours going to 80, 90 grams of carbs. We touched on this last year in season 1 when I did the education on just carbohydrate. Research would tell us right now up to 60 grams of carbohydrate, your body can digest pretty easily if it's just one source of carbohydrate, okay? If you're going to go over 60 grams of carbohydrates, so start pushing up to the 80, 90, 100 grams of carbs per hour, you do want to make sure that it's mixed carbohydrate sources, with one of those carbohydrate sources being fructose. And this allows the body to digest, absorb, and utilize a higher dosage of carbohydrate during training. I will generally, for easy numbers, have my clients start out at 50 grams of carbs per hour of training, because it's easy math. 50 grams of carbs, 4 calories per gram, it's an extra 200 calories. And once again, this goes on top of baseline. So if I have someone that's baseline nutrition, 2,400 calories, 240 grams of protein, just keeping numbers easy. I'm not worried about carbohydrate and fat. I will have them consume 50 grams of carbs per hour of training if they're going over an hour of training at a certain time, especially when they're training for events, okay? After exercise, using an effective refueling strategy after exercise can help optimize recovery and promote desired adaptations to training. Only time that a protein shake trumps real food is the post-workout setting. I recommend Ignition as your carbohydrate source, Formula One as your protein. Okay, this is the only time I'll say that a supplement trumps real food. Replenishing of glycogen occurs faster after exercise due to increased blood flow to the muscles and increased ability of the muscle to take up glucose. The muscle cell sensitivity effective of insulin during this period. As such, exercise promotes glycogen synthesis, restoring of glycogen in the liver and the muscle. That is what Ignition is. It is a first form product that is a glucose with a water-soluble vitamin. So some Ignition, Formula One, which is your protein, whey protein isolate, in the post-workout setting is one of my recommendations to everyone that I work with. Milk chocolate and salted peanut butter are my favorite flavors. Check them out. It is critical to provide the body with at least 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate, 2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram to be a little bit more specific, and 25 to 35 grams of high quality protein. Okay. So once again, kind of generic recommendations there. Generally what I recommend, because the Formula One comes in, serving size of a scoop, which is 20 grams. I generally recommend between 20 and 40 grams per individual. Okay. Even an extra scoop. So have someone that's struggling to get their protein in and they're already doing a post-workout stack as a habit, it's easy to add extra scoop of protein in that setting for extra 20 grams of protein a day. So you could definitely do more. You're not going to, lose the protein over a certain amount. Your body will utilize it. And this is a great point to have it. All right. Protein helps replenish muscle glycogen stores, stimulate muscle protein synthesis, AAA, recovery and growth, and repair damage caused by the exercise. So keep that in consideration, right? This is the best time to optimize recovery is directly after a workout. Hydration. It does not take much water loss to affect performance. A mild dehydration as measured by change in body weight, less than 1%, can slightly negative influence cognitive function and involves slowly working memory, increased tension or anxiety and fatigue, and increased error-related visual, 2 mistakes in one podcast. Increased error related to visual vigilance. Okay, so basically decreased performance from a mental standpoint if you're dehydrated. And then 2% dehydration has bigger impacts on our mental function, mood, and energy level. So some things with hydration is if you're dehydrated, I do like to see it with rehydrate with a electrolyte solution. So making sure that you've got some electrolytes inside of your water to prevent dehydration, water is totally fine. So don't think that you have to have, electrolytes at all times. Okay. So something very important to note: to prevent dehydration, to stay hydrated, water is fine. But once you're dehydrated, you definitely want to use a electrolyte solution to increase hydration back to normal status. Fluid recommendations. Fluid recommendations can vary from 2 to 6 liters per day. And then, yes, we generically recommend half your body weight in ounces as a standard recommendation, as I should get this in daily, and then replace any fluids lost during training. On average, 20-25% of fluid intake comes from our beverages, but you also get some hydration, from your food. So keep that in mind. As we go down, we have a table here that makes recommendations before: 8 to 16 ounces of water, 2 hours before, drink 4 to 8 ounces of water afterwards. So just make sure you are hydrating throughout the day. Okay. You could do a sweat test yourself. So exercise for an hour, weigh yourself before exercise. If you don't drink anything during, weigh yourself after. And then the difference would be how much you're losing. Okay. If you do drink during training, then you could weigh yourself and then once again subtract how much you've drank, and then figure out how much more you need to have secondary to that. All right. As we continue on in here, we do have goes into just a chapter or a section on carbohydrate and electrolyte, and it's just the benefits: maintains hydration during exercise, ensures rehydration after exercise, replaces electrolyte loss during sweating. And we touched on that. Remember, you can prevent dehydration with water alone, but once you're dehydrated, making sure that you do have a electrolyte beverage is going to be very, very important to recover from the dehydration status. All right. Something to point out here, and it's in black bold inside this chapter: overhydration. Overhydration can cause excessive dilution of sodium in the blood, potential life-threatening condition called hyponatremia. In situations where soldiers are drinking to a schedule or a regimen over prolonged periods or less intense physical activity, it is important to consider risk factors, signs, and ways to mitigate this condition. So don't overdo your water. Okay. If you're just like, I'm going to drink a gallon a day, and you missed out on a lot of that, and you're just chugging that at the end of the day, it's not highly recommended. Okay. Spreading your water out throughout the day, making sure that you are getting electrolytes in either via packets or inside of the nutrition plan in general is going to be your best approach for overall health. So just be aware that you can overconsume your water. Some risk factors: cool and less humid conditions that make fluid loss considerably less than expected, overconsumption of beverages that are low in sodium content, inadequate food consumption, along with overhydration. Some signs and symptoms to pay attention to: swollen fingers, disorientation, abdominal bloating, reduced urine output. And then mitigation strategies. Let's talk about adequate food consumption and then spreading the fluid out throughout the day. All right. Bear with me, getting down to the last point here. And it goes into the environment. Okay. So something we look at, especially the military, is what environment are we in? Okay. We're going to be in the field for an extended period of time. And that is the field going to be hot? Is it going to be cold? Those are all things to take into consideration. Okay. Nutrition requirements largely depend upon environment conditions. Hot and dry environments require different levels of nutrition than cool and moist environments. High altitudes demand different nutritional requirements than low altitude. So these are all things to take into consideration when you're setting up your nutrition program, depending on where you're at. Okay. Working or exercising in heat intensifies water and electrolyte loss throughout sweating. The amount of sweat and fluid depends on environmental temperature and humidity, work rate, fitness level, and acclimation, volume rate of fluid replacement. So if you are in a hot environment, thinking about hydration sticks, hydration packets could be something that you take in consideration, even if you're traveling. So maybe you live up north and you're traveling south for the summer and you're still going to train and work out. Those are things that you should take into consideration. When the same task carried out in a thermal nutrient environment, such as a range of temperatures that of the immediate environment, which are standard healthy adults can maintain body temperature, is performed in a hot environment, energy requirements increase slightly due to the increased work domain. So think about that. You're doing the same amount of work, same amount of activity, but if it's in a hotter environment, you're going to need more calories and you're going to burn more energy. When living or working in temperature range from 86 to 104 degrees, energy intake typically can increase by 2.5 to 10%, over general activity level. So endurance athletes, something to think about, if you've been training in lower temperatures and you're going to a hotter environment, you're going to burn more calories. Therefore, you might need to increase more calories during your training. You may need more calories on your bike or during your run during summer months than you would during winter months. That's something to take into consideration. But once again, it's all kind of going to come back to a little bit of trial and error when it comes to our training. Okay. So a lot of these are great generic recommendations, when it comes to, things that we're looking at. On the flip side, in the cold, exposure to cold environments seriously changes the human body. Blood vessels tighten to conserve energy. Shivering is initiated to generate heat and guard against hypothermia. Side effects of this responses are an increase in urine output, an increase in energy metabolism. Therefore, the most nutritional consideration for cold environment is energy intake, glycogen stores, fluid status, vitamin, mineral needs. Okay. So it's just something, once again, we're looking at extreme conditions. We would want people to be aware of making these changes. Okay. And for those that are getting more into your endurance sports, with a lot of our listeners are, and you're training outside, these are some things to take in consideration inside of your fueling underneath these conditions. Okay. Last part we have is glycogen stores underneath missions in the cold. Prior to deployment to cold environment, pre-mission diet should ensure that glycogen stores are optimized. Likewise, high carbohydrate diet is preferred during cold exposure, as carbohydrates are needed to replenish glycogen being used to maintain core temperature. Minimum of 400 grams of carbs per day are necessary in the cold. And once again, that's a generic statement. Okay. High is relative. What's high to one person might not be high to another. But I just think this is something that we should take in consideration. If you're in a cold environment, you might need more carbohydrate, less fat inside of the diet. Okay. Last part, we got therapeutic nutrition. I'm just going to mention this in general. It just talks about that, if someone is going to have an injury, good nutrition aids in recovery, management of calories and essential nutrients based on pre-injury nutrition status, severity and type of trauma occurred. Okay. So we're talking about burns, whether it be minor or traumatic wounds, TBIs, traumatic brain injury, that type of stuff. And this is where, okay, hey, it's a medical condition. There's an injury. You want to work with someone that is going to be up to looking at increasing performance inside the individual. And it's now kind of want to wrap up, the nutritional readiness chapter, today. Okay. The last part of it is medical conditions beyond acute injuries and illnesses. Medical nutrition therapy for the treatment of, lifestyle associated conditions contribute to soldiers' readiness and life expectancy. These conditions can be included to hypertension, insulin resistance, high cholesterol. Let's just stick with the easy term for me. And soldiers should seek counseling from a registered dietitian and treatment. There we go. This is what I do. This is the role that I play. Okay. But something I want to mention in here, and this is something I looked at, just, went to a conference, and there was a gentleman there from the University of South Carolina that was talking about TBIs. Okay. And TBIs being traumatic brain injuries. And we can also look at this from a concussion standpoint. So pulling it back to, okay, Jeremy, how does this relate to me? If I'm not in the Army, what am I looking at here? So a lot of us, have had concussions. We hit our head, this type of thing. They were showing stats that supplementing with creatine, either right after the TBI, right after the concussion, showed a 50% decrease or quicker recovery in symptoms from the TBI or the concussion in these athletes / soldiers. Okay. And that is big. Okay. So we look at recovering quicker, and prolonging any negative effects that are coming out of these head injuries. The power of creatine was real. Okay. And the next one that they talked about with decreasing inflammation was omega-3s. And this is good information to hear from my perspective, because I ethically feel comfortable that most individuals need to be on magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, and once you've adopted a healthy lifestyle, creatine monohydrate. I think those three supplements are supplements that you should be on long term. Okay. Now we can argue when you first start your journey, like a multivitamin is great, especially if you don't eat a variety of foods. But I could also argue as you start eating better and you start eating a variety of foods that you don't have to, take the multivitamin. But I would still say magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, and creatine should be something that everyone should take. And cost effective, it is a very inexpensive price point when you look at omega-3 fatty acids, magnesium, and creatine inside of your routine. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those three products, and they can be life-changing, not only from a health standpoint, but also a performance standpoint. Appreciate you guys listening. If you have anything you want me to dive into specifically, let me know. And I hope you have a wonderful day.